The importance of being aware of the language we use around disability cannot be underestimated. Many of us may not even be aware of the language people with disability accept as appropriate. The following are some examples of do's and don'ts communication tips for engaging with people with disabilities. Most people with disability prefer to be referred to as people with disabilities rather than the disabled. Use of the term invalid to describe a person with a physical disability or infirmity may cause offence. This term, when directly interpreted, translates to invalid. The term is antiquated and is best avoided. The term handicapped may cause offence, having its root in the Victorian era and the charitable model of disability. It is the barrier that may be referred to as the handicap rather than the person. Wheelchair-bound may not be acceptable to a person using a wheelchair, as they do not see themselves as defined by being bound to a chair. The chair merely provides mobility for the person who cannot walk. Often we hear people with particular conditions being referred to as a paraplegic or an epileptic. The use of the a or an here implies the person can be categorised by the disability. It would be better to refer to a lady with epilepsy, for example. Unless a person has no sight at all, then it is more acceptable to refer to people with vision impairment as opposed to the blind. The term normal is often used as a benchmark for describing a person without a disability. This would be best avoided and might be better to refer to able-bodied persons or those with disabilities. Many people who are unable to hear see themselves as belonging to a group with its own language and culture and use a capital D when referring to themselves. Otherwise, it is preferable to use a person with a hearing impairment. We often hear terms like disabled toilets or the disabled parking bay. This is incorrect in that the toilet or parking space is not disabled, and while we all know what is meant here, it would be more appropriate to use terms such as accessible toilet or parking bay. People with conditions such as epilepsy, for example, prefer the use of terms seizures than fits. Use of the term retarded can be viewed as a derogatory, antiquated term and is best avoided. People with intellectual disability is an acceptable term. Here are some other disability awareness tips. When talking to a person using a wheelchair for more than a few minutes, it's good to use a chair to make sure you are at the same eye level as them. Look and speak directly to a person with a disability, rather than looking at or speaking through a friend they may have with them.
Don't assume, I suppose, that people require assistance either, always ask. If you're at a crossing and you see that there's a visually impaired person, or if someone may look as if they're having difficulty, to offer assistance, and if they accept, then to say, would you like to take my arm? And you'd guide them across the road in the sighted guide position. So they would take your arm and they would hold your arm just above your elbow with 4 fingers on the inside and the thumb on the outside, and they'd be standing slightly back from you.
Try to find a good way to communicate with a person who is deaf or has hearing loss. They may lip read, sign, or write down what they want. Also, don't feel you need to shout at or speak slower to a person with a disability.
I think the first thing is, if you come across someone on the street and you know them, and you may not know if they are visually impaired, just to say hello to them and also say your name. So, hi Mary, it's Anne-Marie here, as you approach the person. So have your name in that. If they're in company then, or you're in company with a group of people, to introduce the people that you're with to the individual. If you're speaking to the person in the group, to say their name, to address them when you're speaking to them, because they won't know that you're actually speaking to them. If you're making an arrangement to meet a visually impaired person, to be punctual. If you're in a restaurant and you see that the person's glass is half empty, ask them, do you require it to be filled? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If you do fill it, don't fill it to the brim. If you're in a shop and there's a visually impaired person that they're handing over their money, hand it back to them and count it back to them. If a person has a guide dog, don't assume that you can actually pet the dog. If they're in harness, they're working, so they normally shouldn't be petted.
Never park on footpaths, even if it's only for 2 minutes, and never use accessible parking bays without having a valid accessible parking permit displayed. DeafHear.ie representative Damien Owens outlines his wish list for raising awareness in the community. This includes people's rights under the law, the right to respect and equality, and equal participation in all aspects of social, vocational and community life. Damien also highlights that 1 baby per 1,000 is born deaf. That amounts to approximately 5,000 people born deaf every year.